Welcome to another of our special series for World Book Day. This is Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video, I want to travel around the world with you in books. This is one of the things I love about reading, is that I can see places and learn about places that I may have never traveled to myself and may never get the opportunity to travel to. So I have 3 books for you today to show you, and I'm going to read just a little snippet from each to give you an idea of where it's set and to give all of us an opportunity to travel the world in books. So this is the #1 Ladies Detective Agency by Alexander McCall Smith, and we are going to travel to Botswana in Africa. Ma Ramotswe had a detective agency in Africa at the foot of Kale Hill. These were its assets: a tiny white van, 2 desks, 2 chairs, a telephone, and an old typewriter. Then there was a teapot in which Ma Ramotswe, the only lady private detective in Botswana, brewed red bush tea. And 3 mugs, 1 for herself, 1 for her secretary, and 1 for the client. What else does a detective agency really need? Detective agencies rely on human intuition and intelligence, both of which Ma Ramotswe had in abundance. No inventory could ever include those, of course. But there was also the view, which again could appear on no inventory. How could any such list describe what one saw when one looked out of Ma Ramotswe's door? To the front, an acacia tree, the thorn tree which dots the wide edges of the Kalahari. The great white thorns a warning, the olive gray leaves by contrast so delicate. In its branches, in the late afternoon or in the cool of the early morning, one might see a go-away bird, or hear it rather, and beyond the acacia, over the dusty roads, the roofs of the town under a cover of trees and scrub bush, on the horizon, in a blue shimmer of heat, the hills, like improbable, overgrown termite mounds. Everyone called her Ma Ramotswe, although if people had wanted to be formal, they would have to have addressed her as Ma Ramotswe. This is the right thing for a person of stature, of which she had never used herself. So it was always Ma Ramotswe, rather than Precious Ramotswe, a name which very few people employed. She was a good detective and a good woman in a good country, one might say. She loved her country, Botswana, which is a place of peace, and she loved Africa, for all its trials. I am not ashamed to be called an African patriot, said Ma Ramotswe. I love all the people whom God made, but I especially know how to love the people who live in this place. They are my people, my brothers and sisters. It is my duty to help them solve the mysteries in their lives. That is what I am called to do. And then in chapter 2, I am Obed Ramotswe, that's Precious's father. And I was born near Malahapi in 1930. Malahapi is halfway between Gaborone and Francistown, on that road that seems to go on and on forever. It was a dirt road in those days, of course, and the railway line was much more important. The track came down from Bulawayo, crossed into Botswana at Plumtree, and then headed south down the side of the country, all the way to Mafeking on the other side. As a boy, I used to watch the trains as they drew up at the siding. They let out great clouds of steam, and we would dare one another to run as close as we could to it. The stokers would shout at us, and the train master would blow his whistle, but they never managed to get rid of us. We hid behind plants and boxes and dashed out to ask for coins from the closed windows of the trains. We saw the white people look out their windows like ghosts, and sometimes they would toss us one of their Rhodesian pennies, large copper coins with a hole in the middle. Or, if we were lucky, a tiny silver coin we called a tiki, which could buy us a small tin of syrup. Malahapi was a straggling village of huts made of brown, sun-baked mud bricks and a few tin-roofed buildings. These belonged to the government, or the railways, and they seemed to us to represent distant, unattainable luxury. There was a school run by an old Anglican priest and a white woman whose face had been half destroyed by the sun. They both spoke Setswana, which was unusual, but they taught us in English, insisting on the pain of a thrashing that we left our own language outside on the playground. On the other side of the road was the beginning of the plain that stretched out into the Kalahari. It was featureless land, cluttered with low thorn trees, on the branches of which there perched the hornbills and the fluttering molopes with their long trailing tail feathers. It was a world that seemed to have no end, and that, I think, is what made Africa in those days so different. There was no end to it. A man could walk or ride forever, and he would never get anywhere. So that's Botswana from the #1 Ladies Detective Agency by Alexander McCall Smith. Let's move along in our travels to the outback in Australia. This is The Lost Man by Jane Harper. From above, from a distance, the marks in the dust formed a tight circle. The circle was far from perfect, with a distorted edge that grew thick, then thin, and broke completely in places. It also wasn't empty. In the center was a headstone, blasted smooth by 100-year assault from sand, wind, and sun. The headstone stood a meter tall and was still perfectly straight. It faced west toward the desert, which was unusual out there. West was rarely anyone's first choice. The name of the man buried beneath that had long since vanished, and the landmark was known to locals, all 65 of them, plus 100,000 head of cattle. Simply as the stockman's grave. That piece of land had never been a cemetery. The stockman had been put into the ground where he had died, and in more than a century, no one had joined him. If a visitor were to run their hands over the worn stone, a partial date could be detected in the indentations. A 1 and an 8 and a 9. Maybe 1890 something? Only 3 words were still visible. They had been carved lower down where they had better shelter from the elements. Or perhaps they had been chiseled more deeply to start with. The message deemed more important than the man. They read, "Who went astray." Months, up to a year even, could slip away without a single visitor passing by, let alone stopping to read the faded inscription or squint west into the afternoon sun. Even the cattle didn't linger. The ground was typically sandy and sparse for 11 months of the year and hidden under murky floodwater for the rest. The cows preferred to wander north where the pickings were better and the trees offered shade. So the grave stood mostly alone, next to a thin 3-wire cattle fence. The fence stretched a dozen kilometers east to a road and a few hundred west to the desert, where the horizon was so flat it seemed possible to detect the curvature of the earth. It was a land of mirages, where the few tiny trees in the far distance shimmered and floated on non-existent lakes. There was a single homestead somewhere to the north of the fence, and another to the south. Next-door neighbors, 3 hours apart. The road to the east was invisible from the grave itself, and road was a generous description. The wide dirt track could sit silent for days without being troubled by a vehicle. The track eventually led to the town of Ballamara, a single street really, which catered loosely for the scattered population that could almost fit into one large room when gathered together. 1,500 kilometers further east lay Brisbane and the coast. At scheduled times during the year, the sky above the stockman's grave would vibrate with the roar of a helicopter. The pilots worked the land from the air, using noise and movement to herd cattle over distances the size of small European countries. For now, though, the sky loomed empty and large. Later, too late, a helicopter would fly over, deliberately low and slow. The pilot would spot the car first with its hot metal winking. The grave some distance away would draw his attention only by chance as he circled back and around in search of a suitable landing site. The pilot would not see the dust circle. It was the flash of blue material against the red ground that would catch his eye. A work shirt, unbuttoned and partially removed. The temperature the past few days had hit 45 degrees in the afternoon peak. The exposed skin was sun-cracked. Later, those on the ground would see the thick and thin marks in the dust and would fix their eyes on the distant horizon, trying not to think about how they had been made. The headstone threw a small shadow. It was the only shade in sight, and its blackness was slippery, swelling and shrieking as it ticked around like a sundial. The man had crawled, then dragged himself as it moved. He had squeezed into that shade, contorting his body into desperate shapes, kicking and scuffing the ground as fear and thirst took hold. He had a brief respite as night fell, before the sun rose and the terrible rotation started again. It didn't last as long on the second day as the sun moved higher in the sky. The man had tried, though. He had chased the shade until he couldn't find any more. The circle in the dust fell just short of one revolution, just short of 24 hours. And then, at last, the stockman finally had company, as the earth turned and the shadow moved on alone, and the man lay still in the center of a dusty grave under a monstrous sky. That was Australia from The Lost Man by Jane Harper. And finally, let's head to the Caribbean. This is The Coconut Killings by Patricia Moyes. This is from 1977. I really enjoy Patricia Moyes. Actually, she wrote in the 70s and the 80s, and her detective is Chief Superintendent Henry Tibbet. And so in this book, they head to the Caribbean. The traveler, wishing to get from England to St. Matthews, must first of all take a jet plane from London to Antigua, which represents more than 99% of the journey in terms of mileage, and is accomplished comfortably in a matter of a few hours. After that, things become more complicated and take longer. The quickest way should be to fly in a small two-engined Heron to the island of St. Mark's, and from there ride on an open launch over the transparent blue waters of the Caribbean in the company of assorted merchandise. Unfortunately, however, the launch runs only once a day and is carefully timed to leave St. Mark's just 10 minutes before the flight from Antigua arrives. For some time now, the authorities on St. Mark's and St. Matthews have had a lurking feeling that this schedule could be improved upon. But things move at a leisurely pace in the Caribbean, and nobody has yet got around to doing anything about it. In practice, the most painless way to make the journey is to spend the day in Antigua, and in the evening, board the ferry boat called the Island Queen. You will wake up the following morning in the sparkling little harbor of Priesttown on the southern coast of St. Matthews. There is controversy locally as to whether the village owns its name to an association with missionaries or whether it is a corruption of Preston, the northern English textile town from which early settlers were said to have emigrated. In any case, the question of convenient transportation from Europe hardly arises on St. Matthews, because less than 1% of the visitors arrive from across the Atlantic. The lifeblood of the island is the stream of wealthy Americans who patronize the golf club, and they are carefully catered for. Smooth, swift jetliners fly from New York, Washington, and Miami to the American island of St. Boniface, where smartly uniformed golf club staff are waiting to escort members to the club's own luxury motor launch for the last lap of the voyage. Mere travelers who are not members of the club must undertake a complicated journey by way of the independent island of Tampico, a journey so exhausting and inconvenient that they seldom try it a second time. It is also possible to hire a local boat to St. Matthews, but this fact is kept very quiet. The committee and members of St. Matthew's Golf Club are anxious to discourage ordinary tourism on the island. Several times, suggestions have been made in St. Mark's that St. Matthews should build a small airstrip, but the golf club owns the only stretch of land flat enough for such a project and has no intention of selling. After all, the rich, beautiful, and important people of the world must have some place where they can enjoy a little privacy. Henry and Emmy Tibbet, arriving from London, traveled by an even more roundabout route than usual because Henry wanted to break his journey on Tampico and visit an old friend there. So, while Sergeant Reynolds went sightseeing on Antigua before embarking on the Island Queen, Henry and Emmy took the Heron to St. Mark's and from there climbed into a tiny 6-seater Piper Aztec and were soon craning their necks to catch a first glimpse of the familiar shape of Tampico, with its harborside town, golden crescents of beach, and hilly green center. Good Lord, Henry said suddenly. Look at that. Look at what? Emmy raised her voice against the thrumming of the engine. Down there, Barracuda Bay. The few years since the Tippets' last visit had transformed the island, where previously there had been just one harborside hotel and one luxury resort complex. Now huge high-rise concrete buildings ringed the sandy bays, gleaming whitely in the brilliant sunshine. An enormous construction site boasted a sign, clearly legible from the air, announcing the imminent completion of the Tampico Hilton. The sheltered anchorage of Barracuda Bay currently harbored no less than 5 big cruise liners, brave with fluttering bunting, and motor launches traced foaming white curves on the sapphire water as they ferried passengers ashore. Inland, developments of holiday homes looked like a sprawl of nursery building bricks on the deep green carpet of the hillside. Uniform little boxes in orderly rows, some brightly painted, some still the dab gray of unfinished breeze block. And then a little bit later, as soon as they left town, however, and began to climb the sinuous track over Goat Hill, things became more familiar. True, the road was tarred for a mile or so beyond the lodge, the Prime Minister's residence. But after that, it became the old, boulder-strewn dirt track that Henry and Emmy remembered. The views were the same as ever. Limpid blue water creaming over coral reefs and breaking on beaches as curved and golden as fresh croissants. White sails of yachts leaning to the breeze, the scatter of tiny rocky islets punctuating the sapphire and emerald sea. Everything was really just the same. So that's a visit to the Caribbean with The Coconut Killings by Patricia Moyes. Hope you've enjoyed this little around the world trip. Do you have a favorite book that takes place in another country from where you live? Do you enjoy traveling through reading the books that you read? If so, let me know down in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear about that. And I hope you've enjoyed this video and this series today in honor of World Book Day. Thanks, and I'll see you for another video again soon. Bye.